Welcome to this public discussion on China and the EU in a Trumpian world. My name is Isabel, Hilton. I have the pleasure of chairing this discussion. And we have three spectacularly qualified participants. On my right, although she protests, is Janka Oertel.
I said I don't normally sit on far right.
Who is Director of the Asia Programme and Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, previously the German Marshall Fund. Well, she's very well known in China circles, so and I'm sure many people have already read her work. To my left, Senior Colonel Zhou. Zhou is retired from the military. He started his military service in 1979, serving successively as a staff officer, Deputy Director General of West Asia and Africa Bureau, and then Deputy Director General of General Planning Bureau of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Ministry of National Defence. You've also worked a lot in Africa, Defence Attaché in Namibia, working also across policy fields in Tsinghua University, and you're a well-known name in international media and again in policy circles and discussions. And again to my left, we have Professor Yang Yao, who is professor at the Chinese Center for Economic Research and the National School of Development in Beijing. He currently serves as the director of CER and Deputy Dean of NSD in charge of academic affairs. He's a very well-known economist in China, and we are going to benefit from his perspective on EU relations. So just on the kind of general points about the EU-China relationship in a Trumpian world, I think even before Washington took the turn it has, there were tensions and problems in the EU-China relationship, and some of those are structural, some of those are related to particular events. At the same time, China and the EU are locked in together in obviously a big trading relationship. China's the EU's second biggest trading partner. And Europe is now probably the most important destination for Chinese companies' FDI. And at the same time, we've had a series of shocks to the relationship, which haven't really been resolved. So, you know, there is the values shock, if you like, issues that arose around Xinjiang, earlier around Tibet, around Hong Kong, mutual sanctions that resulted. Then came the pandemic, and certainly the European perception that there was a lack of cooperation from China on understanding and having a frank accounting of the origins of the pandemic, not helped by this being a period of wolf warrior diplomacy in China and having very kind of muscular and aggressive response from certainly some Chinese diplomats. I would cite the Chinese ambassador in France as an example. And then we had the full-scale invasion of Ukraine only weeks after the declaration of limitless friendship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and the continuing diplomatic and economic support that China is perceived to give to Russia over Ukraine. Now, on top of that, there are perhaps more structural challenges of China's economic and industrial rise and the challenges that is presenting to European industries, particularly in Germany, of course, the biggest industrial economy in Europe, and the challenge that this is a structural challenge of different modes of production coming into conflict, which could well destroy what is left of European industry with serious political results. So we have a lot of things to discuss. We have trade imbalances, we have the problem of geopolitical alignment, and now for Europe, we have where does Europe belong? It's no longer a reliable ally or indeed a subscriber to the liberal international order. And what is the condition of that order? What does that mean for Europe? And how can we have a constructive relationship with China that preserves the values that Europe still holds here. How can that be managed? How can risks be managed? How can relationships have a constructive as well as a defensive position? So essentially, the structure of this event is that I'm going to invite the three panelists to give some opening remarks. We will then have a conversation, and then we very much want to hear from all of you. So I'm going to begin with, no, I'm not. I'm going to begin with Zhou. So, and so the generic question is please tell us, Zhou, how you see the European-China relationship now. What is its condition, if you like, and what do you see as its problem?
Well, from what I read this morning, China has just lifted sanction on a few parliamentarians of the European Union. So this is a clear signal that China wants to improve this relationship. And I believe with Donald Trump's reckless and capricious behaviors, I believe China-European relationship will just move forward. The only thing is about the war in Ukraine, which has soured China-European relationship. And from Chinese point of view, I would believe that this is rather unfair for China, because China certainly was not informed about what Putin was about to do, but China has to bear the consequences, because of its so-called unlimited partnership with Russia. This term is indeed written in the joint agreement before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I understand how people might feel about it. But as I was talking to Financial Times, well, if I say, for example, I want to develop my friendship with you, but I have for a moment, this friendship has to be limited. Then what would you say? So you just need to understand that this kind of relationship from that context. And the war has actually proven that China, in spite of its friendship with a neighboring country, China still has upheld the bottom line, which primarily are two things. The first thing is President Xi has made it quite clear, that no nuclear weapons would be allowed to use in Europe. The second thing is, in spite of the Western acquisition of China, of supporting Russia economically, China has not so far provided any military assistance to Russia. Because, well, if you have done that, it would not go uncovered. So I think these are the bottom lines. And I believe, I don't know how long the war will last, but I believe China can actually make some contributions toward the resolution of the war in Europe, primarily in two areas. The first thing is, it won't happen now. Why? Because the US and Russia are talking to one another directly, and I don't believe, in spite of China's proposing beginning of the 12-point peace plan or its joint efforts with Brazil to make some proposals, all this will not work. But what might work will come later. That is when the two warring parties reach a ceasefire, because no war will last forever. There definitely will be a time when a ceasefire will be in place. Or if that kind of ceasefire becomes somewhat more consolidated with a kind of armistice agreement, then China could play the role. Why do I say that? Because during the ceasefire, there is a possibility that all the major powers will be invited to provide a kind of collective security guarantee to both sides. Because Ukraine is afraid of Russia, and then on Russia's side, Russia doesn't want to look alone, to look lonely. So that is why President Putin always talk about China, Brazil, and India to be honest brokers. They could play such a role. So I believe that is a time when China could play a role. The second if is if peacekeeping is needed. So far we have seen a lot of proposals coming from Polish Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, or President Zelensky, or French President Emmanuel Macron about sending European peacekeepers. I don't believe it will work, because if these peacekeepers come from NATO countries, Russia would simply take them as wolves in sheep's clothing. So the best formula, in my eye, is for China, one of the UN Security Council members, and also the largest contributing country of the UN Security Council, to take the lead and joined by some selected countries from the global south, such as India. Why do I mention India? Because India is also one of the largest to contributing countries, plus some selected European countries that are not NATO countries, and that is my best formula.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to the question of collective security guarantees and how they might be implemented. Email, Professor, please.
Okay. So I may comment so many talk about the economic side. So on the economic side, we see that the structural tension between China and the US and the Europe is increasing in recent years. This is only because in China, the manufacturing sector is moving up so quickly, right? So if you look at the world comparison, China's manufacturing output today is 35% of world total. What does that mean? It's actually the sum of G7. Then in terms of value added, 30%. But if you look at China's GDP in world total, only 17%. And China's consumption, only 14%. Right. So which means, relatively speaking, China has to export half of its manufacturing output to other countries. Okay, of course, including Europe. Okay, but I think we have to understand why China has accumulated so huge manufacturing capacity. Many people talk about the government subsidies. Yes, Chinese government, particularly local governments, subsidize industry quite a lot. But you have to ask why they do that, why they can afford this, right? The fundamental reason to an economist is that China saves too much. Okay, so that enables local governments to subsidize the industry, right? How much does China save each year? 45% of GDP, right? 45%, which means China each year saves about $9 trillion US. $9 trillion US, right? So that's a huge savings. Okay, I think that has a lot to do with Chinese culture. Chinese people love saving. Think about the household saving. Okay, many people say, "Hey, the growth of income in China has slowed down." Yes, it has slowed down. But if you look at the household saving, in 2023, Chinese household saved 15 trillion RMB. Last year, increased to 18 trillion RMB. And today, if you look at the total household saving in China, is actually more than China's GDP, right? So many people say, oh, it's because China does not have enough social security. That's not true. If you look at China's pension, that's one of the most generous in the whole world. Okay, it's not about lack of social security. It's just a culture. Not just Chinese people love saving. Chinese government loves the saving. Chinese government, saving in the form of investment. Chinese government invests so much. Okay, and the Chinese companies love saving too. Chinese companies usually don't give dividends to their shareholders, right? And the SOEs don't surrender their profits to the government. What do they do with their profits? They reinvest. Okay, I think that's the fundamental. I mean, this issue to us, economists, is not new. Back to 15 years ago, even before 2008, right? We were talking about the so-called global imbalances. Okay, and what's the cause of global imbalance? Chinese save too much, United States consume too much. That's it, right? That's a kind of a mirror image to each other. Today, it's still the same. Okay, so that's the fundamental reason. Okay, but because China invests so much in manufacturing, that causes a direct competition with Europe. It's because China is advancing so fast in the so-called medium range technologies that Europe used to have competitiveness for other countries. But now I don't think that China has won all the competition with Europe, but China is catching up really quickly. Right? And in some areas, Chinese technology now has overtaken European technologies. Particularly, let me give you an example in the car industry, right? Particularly EVs. Okay, so that's also the reason why Europe imposed the tariffs on China's EVs. It's not because, like in the past, Chinese labor was cheaper than European labor. No, it's because of technology, right? China didn't follow European the conventional road to build cars, like diesel engine or petrol engine. China started the extremely inefficient battery technology. Okay, but we know that there have been plenty examples in which so-called inferior technologies in the end took over others more efficient technologies. Who knows? And the technology can be improved over years, right? So today, Chinese EVs plus those smart driving technologies, right? Now Chinese EVs have become so competitive in the world market. Right? So that's the kind of competition here. And I don't think anytime soon China will change its growth model. It's so hard. Right? There is kind of a huge inertia over there because China, as I said, the whole country is still saving so much. And also the US-China competition has the opposite effect, right? Because the competition tells the Chinese leaders, United States wants to stop China's technological progress, and in the end, they want to stop China's growth. Right? So what China should do? China should double down on the investment into high technology. Okay. I mean, that's structural. It's really difficult to change. So what's the solution? I think the only solution is for Europe to open the direct investment from China. I understand that there is kind of lack of trust between Europe and China. But to me, that's more psychological than real, right? It's about what kind of a security issue that exists between China and Europe. They're so far away. Okay, I really don't think that we're going to clash militarily, right? So the Ukraine war, once a peace treaty is signed, is going to go away, right? So for Europe and China, I think we only have common interests. I don't think we really have that kind of a conflict. Okay. So in this case, if Europe allow Chinese investment into Europe, then China can help Europe to build up its industry again. It's just like several decades ago, Europe helped China with China's industrialization. Now it's the reverse is happening. Okay, so I still remain kind of optimistic about EU-China relations because I'm a economist, right? I believe in rationality.
We could debate that one too. It's not, yeah.
That's the political scientist to bring in some pessimism. It's going to be the role, I guess. Maybe just as a bit of a disclaimer, I've been doing this work on sort of China-Europe, US relations for the last 17 years. I started from a perspective of there's so much potential in the China-Europe relationship. There's so much potential in China's role in the multilateral system. And I found myself in 2018, at the beginning of the first Trump administration, all of a sudden in the trenches of a war that I never wanted to be part of, and having to learn everything about 5G antennas that never was in the curriculum before. I wasn't interested in it either, but I felt like I had to, because that was where the big debates were moving. Ever since then, I have not been allowed to get off that train and had to learn about wind turbines, I had to learn about solar panels, I had to learn about solar inverters, because everything is political. I think this is where the European debate has moved, and why I would say I would make maybe 5 points. I would maybe slightly counterintuitively to the hyperbole of the media discussion that we're having in Europe say, objectively, China is the bigger economic problem to Europe than the United States right now. Secondly, there is no charm offensive from China. Thirdly, Brussels has a plan. That's a counterintuitive one as well. Fourthly, not so counterintuitive, member states have huge potential to undercut the plan. And it all comes down to Germany. Let me kind of unpack that a little bit. Why is China the bigger economic problem for Europe right now, bigger economic challenge than the United States? First of all, the tariffs were we were ready for that. In Europe, we had kind of anticipated that that would come. And there are ways to A, retaliate, to B, negotiate, but also C, to absorb some of the shocks that are coming from that. There's a high degree of localization of European industry already, particularly in the German car industry. The IRA, counterintuitively as well, maybe has incentivized a lot of European investment in the US already. So it's now a question of how can this be negotiated? But there is a strong belief that this is a relationship that is so fundamental to the overall economic relationship that a solution can be found, albeit it will be one with higher tariffs across the board, but not at a catastrophic level. And it will be something that the European economy can weather. The challenge that the German economy faces particularly, and with it sort of dependent and indirectly the rest of the European economy, is the threat of industrialization through precisely what Yao Yang was presenting, China's manufacturing capacity in precisely the sectors that Europe is strong. And these are not the sectors that the US is strong at, because we build competitive EVs in Europe, the US doesn't. We build wind turbines that are still competitive at global level and sold around the world. The US is kind of dipping on that front. So we are having a problem, a structural problem, I think Yao Yang has presented that really well, in the Europe-China relationship that doesn't go away through friendly words. It is a real and structural problem that can only be mitigated through protective measures on the European side and massive investments in competitiveness and innovation on the European side. This brings me to Brussels has a plan. Oh, no, let me start first with the charm offensive. Why there's no charm offensive? Because I think that's really important. There is this talk of a charm offensive the Chinese leadership vis-a-vis Europe. And we call it the charm offensive in the FT and the Economist or in the European newspapers. What it actually is a moderate adjustment in the conversation. No offer has been put on the table to change anything about the economic relationship right now. No offer has been put on the table on sort of fundamental grievances that the Europeans have had. And Zhou has mentioned the sanctions that were lifted against the acting MEPs. At the same time, the sanctions against European think tanks and previous MEPs have not been lifted. At the same time, a visit that was supposed to be planned by Xi Jinping for the anniversary summit is not taking place. At the same time, China's president is going to the 9th of May Victory Day parades in Moscow. At the same time, China-Russia relations are as stable as they were. So for Europe, nothing has fundamentally changed right now, other than that the conversation has become slightly more friendly. That's a good thing in itself, but it doesn't change anything structurally about the relationship. Brussels is not known for being particularly fantastically geostrategically attuned most of the time, nor is it known for being fast, nor is it known for being fast at implementing things. And for once, I have to say, on China, in the last few years, they've done a really good job. Not only have they, since the beginning of the post-Trump administration, built a toolkit needed to actually deal with this issue, from the foreign subsidies regulation to the anti-coercion instrument to IPI, the international procurement instrument, to FDI screening mechanisms. They have basically put a bunch of Brussels lawyers on the problem and said, fix it, like find a solution for it. There are some ingenious tools that have been created. The foreign subsidies regulation, we can go into detail if you're interested in it. It's a magnificent bureaucratic tool with which you can actually get at the problem that the European economy is facing. At the same time, Brussels has tried to take measure, which is, I think, in the EV tariffs, a really, really good example to say, look, we have a distortion here. The distortion is real. We can measure the distortion that is real because prices are undercut so significantly. But we're not going to, across the board, apply a 150% tariff like India or 100% tariff like the United States. We are going to look at company by company how big the distortion really is. And we're going to factor in how willing the respective company is to work with us on this. How willing is the company to be transparent about their situation? How willing are they to actually help us to come to a solution? So this was a pretty nuanced approach on the tariffs, for example, that the Commission has presented. So they had a toolkit of offensive measures, of defensive measures, and a strategy with which to push it forward. Enter the second Trump administration and panic. And that's the problem. Now you have panic. Nothing actually changes about that situation with China about this. But once the panic has been injected, all member states get nervous. Because now you have to do something. You have to present to your people that you are doing something about this problem. And the perceived problem of the Trump tariff is the first one that you need to do something about. But then on the other side, the solution could be now we work more with China. It seemed to be the intuitives, almost like a revolving door, like as if there were magic involved, right? The US door closes, well, it must mean that the China door opens up. But there is no magic in this. This is just fundamentally an illusion, but one that is very helpful for a politician that is under pressure. So if you're Pedro Sanchez at the moment, then being able to announce after a visit to China that there will be a massive investment near Barcelona is a good thing. It doesn't matter whether the investment comes immediately. It doesn't matter whether there are hurdles to cross. There's an immediate political gain in making that announcement. And that is the problem with member states being now the biggest source of potentially undercutting an approach of the Commission that is simply designed to rebalance the relationship with China and to create leverage in an economic relationship that is troubling for the Europeans. And the biggest problem here is, and this is where I think Yang and I agree on everything, the problem is that on the FDI, he believes it's a solution, I believe it's a problem. Because the greenfield investment from Chinese companies, that sounds immediately attractive, right? Just come here, invest in Europe, create some value added in Europe, some technology transfers, some joint ventures. It creates European jobs. How can that be bad? Well, first of all, Xi Jinping has been on the record saying, I don't want companies to share sensitive technology. That's problem number one. Might be able to mitigate that one. Second problem is going to be political influence comes with these investments. It means that once it's European jobs on the line, it has the potential to massively undercut European consensus. So once you have a big factory, a BYD factory in northern Italy, do you think the Italian government is totally free to decide what it wants in the next council meeting? And I think we still have no sense of dimension of this. So, I mean, I think it's an obvious question, but how many factories does Tesla have in China? One. So it's when you're saying sort of how many factories are relevant to tilt the balance and change everything, it can be one. And I think that's where we are looking at sectors in which we still have competitiveness. What is the solution for this? I do think that Chinese investments, for example, in areas in which Europe does not have competitive companies, solar panels, batteries, is interesting and should be explored, and where technology transfer and maximum leverage at the European level should be explored. But in sectors in which Europe has competitive companies, from EVs to actually wind technology, for example, it should be very, very strongly restricted how much investment from a Chinese company can be made. Why does it all come down to Germany in the end? Because we have a new, oh, I'm German, I'm from Berlin. So it was exciting last few days. And we now have a new government. And everyone has high hopes in this government. Merz is going to save us all. I am skeptical that he's going to live up to the expectations, particularly on the European end. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt for the time being to actually manage to bridge the differences across the EU, build relationships and friendships again with Macron and Tusk, and sort of reinvigorate the European economy through the defense industry. All of these things may be possible. But most important will be, how does Merz deal with the China question? Does he believe that a quick fix and a quick solution and a little bit of market access for German companies is more important under the current circumstances of massive economic pressure than the kind of broader long-term strategic European agenda? And quite frankly, the jury's out on that one. I am old enough to remember the first trade war with the United States and the fantastic deals that very select, very few German companies got at the time that really tilted the European conversation, because all of a sudden we were at the comprehensive agreement on investment that Merkel herself pushed forward. So I would say, I think that the German leadership has learned a lot of lessons. I do think that with the personnel that is in place now, there is a real chance that this will be a more robust and a more European approach. But quite frankly, every government is susceptible to massive industry pressure. Every government is susceptible to bad polling and bad economic data. And how long the CDU-led government that holds for the first time since the 1960s, not only the Chancellery, but also the Foreign Ministry, the Economics Ministry, and the Interior Ministry, so all the relevant ministries for these questions, and cannot shy away from this. It's not, you cannot say, oh, like during the traffic light coalition, right? It's the others that want this, and therefore we have to be a bit ambiguous. You have to be pretty clear. You can guarantee policy coherence, and if you can't deliver, it's going to be very difficult for you to kind of bring that narrative down. So the only answer is for sort of dealing with the challenge that China poses and rebalancing the relationship to a level where one can actually meet on eye level again, is that Europe needs to be more protective in some areas, more creative than others, but certainly more European on everything. Maybe I'll end there.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we have, yes, I think that's a fantastically interesting map that has been set up. I just want to begin by picking you up on the question of Germany, because you talk about the problem of FDI and the influence that a big factory would give to China in terms of affecting German behaviour, etc. And you can certainly see that Chinese investments in Greece resulted in Greece never voting to condemn China on human rights or whatever. On the other hand, isn't it also true that Germany had a very pro-China position because of the fact that VW and BASF had massive investments in China, which were doing rather well? VW is not doing so well now. BASF is still doing okay. So what's the difference? I mean, the influence comes one way or the other. So couldn't we manage that?
I don't think we can manage both at the same time. And they're still both going to be then present for a little while. So if you look at the Panama Port deal, the CK Hutchison deal, I don't know who's followed that, but the fact that the Chinese leadership was willing to openly intervene with a Hong Kong company doing business that is registered in the whatever Seychelles with their owner living in Canada or having a Canadian passport, tells you the Chinese leadership is willing, for political reasons, to intervene in private deals. And that is an important message that is being sent. And the fact that they don't mind openly saying that they are willing to intervene in this should be a very, very high degree of like a big red light flashing for everyone that says Chinese investments are coming with an unproblematic, because we don't know what the ask will be yet, but there could be an ask attached to it. And we need to be very sure that we're resilient enough to withstand that ask and to be willing to say, we don't care about the 600 jobs that are related to that or the 2,000 jobs that are created through that. We're willing to withstand that pressure. We've seen it with the Lithuania case also, that political pressure had been used for European member states for relatively petty reasons, I would say, from that perspective. So I think we're a bit clear in Europe that we're not immune to the Chinese leadership using its powers if they deem necessary for political purposes that can be big or small, but that can definitely be present. Then there is the German car industry. And that's the problem of itself, because you have just this last week, the Shanghai Auto Show, CEO of Volkswagen has said, we're ready to attack. 2026 is going to be our year. We're aiming for 15% market share in the future. Now, if you also know the figure that kind of foreign car sales in China in total have just dipped under 20%, then that's, let's say, one could say ambitious. One could also say absolutely delusional. But it's a good figure to pose and to say that this is our future, and you will need some kind of creative bookkeeping tricks on how to say that that is actually going to happen. So what I'm saying is there is a version of this that is a group of CEOs that have to tell a certain story because they invested so deeply that if they were to backtrack from their story, the hit to their company would be so massive. And so what they're all doing is just kicking that can down the road and saying, not under my watch, once I can have cash in my bonus, whatever happens, happens. So I think this is something where, and this is in the interest of the Chinese leadership as well, of course, to keep some of these companies happy. I would like to kind of point everyone to the final picture of the China Development Forum, where you saw the CEO of Mercedes, Oleg Alenius, very tall, thin, between Xi Jinping and Li Qiang, very proudly standing there and kind of being very proud, but also that his largest shareholder, single shareholder, is a Chinese company. So how much is that actually the interest of German businesses or the interest of a multinational company that may not intersect at all times with German societal interests? So I think this is where we're in a situation right now where Merz has said pretty publicly, whether he will uphold that later on is a different story, that he will not bail out German companies that take on too much risk, and that he believes German companies should de-risk their investments. We see a lot of investment drawn down. It's just that a couple of big ones are doubling down, and they localize massively in China for China to be more resilient against international pressures. But that's sort of, there are multiple very complex dynamics at play. I think the German government now has to be more ready to what I would call dual de-risking from a US that is has gone a bit wild, and from a China that continues to be sort of building its own trade war economy at the cost of others.
Thank you, Yang. You I think described this issue, the question of the threat to European industrial economies, particularly Germany, as primarily a matter of technology, of Chinese advanced the technology of EVs. That's certainly true. But on the other hand, the European Union would say, well, that's not entirely the reason for tariffs. It's not just a matter of trying to contain Chinese technological advance. There was a very long document which listed the privileges that were afforded to Chinese companies at home, which enabled them to compete in ways that were regarded as unfair in Europe. Do you acknowledge that at all? I mean, it's not cheap labor. This is about cheap money. It's about cheap land. It's about lots of other benefits, I would say, that Chinese companies enjoy.
First of all, everything is cheaper in China anyway, right? Money is cheap because China saves so much, right? It's basically economics. It's not because the government subsidizes those industry, particularly in EV industry, right? You look at this, most of those so-called new forces are actually private companies who don't enjoy any privileges from the government. Okay, actually, they primarily raise their money from outside China, not from within China. Chinese government does subsidize EVs, but most governments do. Right? United States actually provides much larger subsidies than China does. Like Trump in his first term, he said, if I don't give you money, Elon Musk, you're not going to make any money out of your EVs. Okay, so this is a new technology. In a sense, China is subsidizing for the whole world because they would believe that in the next several decades or even longer time, climate change is the biggest threat to human being. Then China is doing the right thing. right? People outside China will say, hey, China has overcapacity. Yes, if you only look at China, yes, capacity, of course, is excessive. But Chinese manufacturing, particularly Chinese technology in green technology, it's not just for China. It's for the whole world. Not just for the world today, but for the world in the next several decades. I mean, look at the human history. That's always the case. Just give it in the 19th century, right? Here in this country, UK has so much overcapacity, right? Right, but you export it to other countries. Okay, you force open China's door, something like that. But rationally thinking back, I think the UK made a huge contribution to the world. Okay, because UK invested so much in those advanced technology, and later on the whole world has benefited. Then in the 20th century, that's the turn of the United States. Today is China. Okay, in the world, there's always one leading country in technology, and that country definitely is going to overinvest into new technologies. I mean, opening our mind, and then you're going to think about, oh, China. I mean, in a sense, we are, in some sense, we are sacrifice our own consumption for the future goods of humankind. Right? We're using our savings to invest into those new technologies. Okay. I mean, United States did it, UK did it, all the same. Okay. Of course, with advanced technology, you get the competitive edge of other countries. That's how the world is working. Okay. So that's what, I want to comment on Janka's view, right? I think her view is totally a German perspective, right? It doesn't represent the whole Europe. Germany, of course, I totally understand why Germany doesn't want to open up the market. Germany wants to set up high tariffs on Chinese goods. Perfect, I understand that. But the other European countries are not going to follow, right? Eastern European countries, Southern European countries are going to open up to Chinese investment. So in that case, what's going to happen to German industry? You are going to face the Chinese competition anyway, and you lose because you don't accept the Chinese investment, right? European countries, particularly Hungary and Italy, as it goes to Spain, have all accepted the Chinese investment in EVs, and they are going to export to other European countries. Okay, so even within EU, this is not an ironclad. Other countries have different thoughts than Germany.
You're being made an offer you can't refuse.
It feels like it. So, no, I think it's important to just stress that Germany was the only country that actually voted no on the tariffs. So it didn't want the tariffs because of the German auto industry, because they were affected as well by this. This is how fair the EU Commission was operating, that they were also slapping tariffs on Volkswagen that are producing cars in China and exporting them to Europe. So I think that was that's like fact number one. The Germans didn't want these tariffs and didn't fight for them. Fact number two is China actually wants to invest in Germany, because that's where you have the talent pool, that's where you have the infrastructure, that's where you have the ecosystem that's actually super attractive. The Chinese car factory, Cherry car factory in Spain has been put on hold after the tariffs, because it's actually not that great of an investment opportunity. And so this is the political play that we have to withstand in Europe as well, that you can investment can be offered multiple times. That's really helpful, right? You can say, we can come here, we can pause, we can come, it can come again, you can offer the same thing again, and you can still create news because everyone will have forgotten what happened 2 years ago. So it's a very, very useful political tool. And we have to look at the real data at the moment, and the real investment from the Chinese side going into the Nordics, it's going into Germany, it's going where high technology is, where it's actually attractive to invest. Yes, there is some final assembly in Hungary. And this is why the BYD factory at the moment is under FSR investigation. So the foreign subsidies regulation is being applied by the Commission. This is going to be the tool of the EU Commission as well that they're going to use for these kinds of investments to see whether they have a distorting effect on the single market. So I think we have to be kind of really clear about what the perspectives are. A number of European countries are deeply worried about what's happening, because if you're in the Visegrad countries, your auto manufacturing, Slovakia is, I think, 90% of their economy is the auto industry. If you are attached to basically the large Germany OEMs, if they're not there anymore, then you're done. And the problem is, if they are the ones that feel the hit last, because the first thing you're going to do is you're going to move some production into China, and that's going to be the production that's going to not be in Germany, because that's the politically most difficult one. So you're going to move like the latest Skoda line, Cupra has the latest line now in China. So this is what's going to happen, is that these countries are going to lose manufacturing faster. And they're not happy with the idea that they are going to be fully dependent on Chinese companies moving in. There's a huge tentativeness, also in Poland, also in other countries at the moment, to be dependent in these specific industries. And this is why I think we need to be nuanced. I think it's very different on EVs than it is from solar panels or from batteries, for example. So I think we need to just have a very nuanced and sort of sober conversation between China and Europe on what is acceptable for both sides. China wants to be strong, but China's like a whale that you've stuffed into a goldfish bowl. It's not Japan in the 70s. If you are talking about the fact that it's like 45% of global manufacturing, then it just means China can build all the cars for the world. No one else needs to build cars anymore. That's actually not a fantastic offer for Brazil, not a fantastic offer for Indonesia, not a fantastic offer for Mexico, not a fantastic offer for Europe. So is there going to be a moment in time in which the Chinese leadership says, as it was done with Japanese leadership at the time, voluntary restraint, minimum price agreements? Is there something that can be done to mitigate these impacts at the moment? Because otherwise the trade barriers will just go up, and they go up not only in Europe, they go up also in countries of the global south. Because at some point, this does not become an attractive offer anymore. So I think for me, this is a conversation to be had between Europe and China on a super sober footing, but where Europe needs to sort of move and kind of claw itself back to a position of strength first, sort of kind of train its muscle first, before it enters that conversation. Because if it enters all bruised and battered already, then it probably doesn't have a chance to stand. And so I think this is where I would kind of position the current efforts and say this is an effort to regain strength and to sort of gather the forces to be able to enter at a sober level and not at a mad level. We're not seeing anything mad happening from the EU. There's no one wants to ban all trade with China. No one wants to slap 150,000% tariffs on anything. It's a very, very sober assessment. And when I talk to the car industry representatives, they say, we really don't understand why the Chinese leadership is putting export controls on critical raw materials for European car producers. We didn't do anything. So being caught in the crossfire of all of this is currently not very advantageous for the Europeans.
So let's look then at how that conversation might begin. And again, you talk about China sacrificing its savings for the global good. So I'm sure we're all grateful for the sacrifice. But the fact is that the government has for 10 years, to my understanding, tried to make the Chinese population spend more. Try to create a domestic consumer market that can absorb some of this surplus industrial goods. There is a mismatch in China between the production and the consumption, as well as internationally, and that hasn't gone very well. But it is an acknowledgement of the problem, and the failure to solve that internal problem is contributing to the problem elsewhere. Do you think that we are nearly at a point where that conversation could be had, because we haven't had it yet?
Oh, I'm glad you raised this question. Well, if you look at the data between 2010 and 2019, the share of Chinese consumption was increasing at actually quite a dramatic pace. Each year increased by 0.8 percentage points. That's big, I tell you, okay? Because the share of consumption in a country is a slow-moving world. It moves really slow, okay? But China made a turn around 2010, okay? But then the pandemic slowed down China's adjustments, okay? On one hand, people feel uncertain about the future, so people reduce their consumption. On the other hand, China produced for all the countries in the world because during pandemic, many countries just shut down or reduced their production, and China was continuing producing. But if you look at the data over the last 2 years after the pandemic, consumption as a share of GDP increased again. Last year, it stood at 56%. Okay, it's kind of going back to the pre-pandemic level. Okay, but you're not going to count on China's increasing domestic consumption. That's going to take a long, long time, decades. Okay, as I said, this is a slow-moving variable. You're not going to see a country's consumption as a share of GDP jumping 5 percentage points over a year. That's crazy. That's unimaginable. Okay, so I don't think that's a solution. No, not a solution. As I said, there's a huge inertia in people's consumption and the saving behavior. Okay, so I understand. And in China, we can't slow. You should tell the government, and also the government is quite aware. Exporting to other countries is not sustainable for China's growth model. Definitely. Okay. But given Chinese manufacturing is so big today, we have to find a solution. I mean, youngest solution, set up a tariff for China, reduce its production or export, right? Voluntary reduction of export. To me, that means waste of resources. Because China still safe, right? So what do? We have to do something using the savings, right? We have to invest in other countries, basically. That's the only solution I can see. Okay, so I still believe. Oh, one thing I want to comment on, Janka. When Chinese companies invest in Europe or any parts of the world, I think in the end we're going to see that Chinese companies become localized. I mean, the Japanese experience is a good example, right? Or set up a good example. It's kind of those luxury brands coming out of Japanese car companies, like a Lexus, like a Infiniti, right? They're all American brands. They're not a Japanese brand because those brands are not sold in Japanese market, right? They created in the United States and they're branded as American brands. Okay. It's in the end probably Chinese companies will do the same. I mean, before the Trump administration began sanctions against Huawei was thinking about the setting up a kind of a second headquarters in Europe. Okay. Then the sanctions and also European sanctions on Huawei stopped that. So, I mean, this is not just a one-way traffic, right? This is definitely two-way traffic. Okay, if the Europeans don't open up the mind, then things will go the other.
Thank you. I am though going to suggest that there is a difference other than scale between Japan in the 90s and China now. And that's to do with, it is to do with technology, that the cars that Japan went on to build in Europe and in the United States were internal combustion engines. They weren't connected. There was no digital element. And I want to sort of come to this question of trust and security. Professor Yang, you mentioned that it was unlikely, since we're not contiguous, that Europe would go to war with China or vice versa. And I'm sure that's true. However, that's not really the situation that we're looking at. We're looking at a world in which the threat landscape in security terms is infinitely broader than it was, because so much of our world is digital. You mentioned Huawei. It wasn't a commercial competition question. It's a security question. Move to 5G and how much critical infrastructure will depend on it. And given the relationship between China and Russia, and this is a very, very active question, of course, for Europe, it continues to be. I wonder if we could perhaps, or you could explain to us how you would reassure Europe that allowing China, for example, allowing Chinese electric connected vehicles en masse in Europe is not a security problem. Perhaps you could reassure us that connecting offshore wind farms made in China technology to critical infrastructure is not and won't be a security problem when China has a relationship with Russia, the limits of which we don't know, and which have drastically affected the trust that I guess both sides were trying to build.
Okay. Well, you see, when Yaya and Janka are having this kind of animated discussion, I really believe security is not an issue between them, right? It's not a big issue at all. So, but on this issue of trust and security, I just can't associate, this problem of having too many EV cars. How they could have become a security issue. I just can't think of like that. I would just prefer Yao to answer this question more from an economic perspective. But when it comes to trust and security, generally speaking, let me talk about this issue of trust. Whether China and EU have enough trust with one another. So this question for me is not really that important. Because I believe I'm one of the few people in China who don't really believe trust is so important for interstate relationship. If we look at the Cold War, even the two enemies could still come to a kind of cooperation because of a mutual fear of each other. So that is why they have established so many treaties. Yeah, all of them are results of fear. Yeah. SALT, START, Open Sky Treaty, or INSEA agreement whatsoever. But out of this kind of professional interaction, both sides have been able to establish kind of a professional trust. Yeah. So actually, this is also my hope for China-US relationship, which is also relevant to all of us, because during the Cold War, I think when we talk about this term, strategic stability, it actually has a kind of a specific, meaning in it. During Cold War, that basically means the parity of nuclear weapons on the two sides. But between China and the US, this picture would be different because definitely China is modernizing its armed forces, including nuclear arsenal. That problem is that we would have to increase some nuclear, have to increase the number of a nuclear arsenal, but still that would be way, way below the United States, which has more than 5,000, and we, according to separate, just have 500, and according to Washington's report last year, 600, right? So I believe in the future, China, US, the strategic stability would lie not in the balance of nuclear weapons, but also in some of the new areas which we have just talked about, such as AI, cyber, and artificial intelligence. And that is the balance between China and the United States, because in these new areas, China doesn't necessarily lag behind. Yeah. When we come to this security, China, your security issue in relevance to Russia, well, I've been trying to talk about this. When you look at the China-Russian relationship, we understand how we feel now. But from Chinese point of view, we have to consider this relationship from a bilateral basis, which is understandable, right? And because we are largest neighbors towards one another, and because of some upheavals in our history, so we have to attach great importance to this relationship. So that means we cannot look at China-Russian relationship through the prism of Europe. Yeah. As I mentioned before, I don't believe you should really worry too much about this relationship. And I believe this war has precisely proven that however seemingly close this relationship is, as I have described this morning, China and Russia are just two lines in parallel. That means no matter how close they are, they would not overlap to become one of the neutral lines. Yeah. And this war has just demonstrated that we're not providing missile weapons, as the Blinken once claimed at claimed last year at the Munich Security Conference, and then in his conversation to BBC, he admitted that he was wrong. China didn't do that, because if China did that, well, you just won't go undiscovered. It's simply impossible.
I think we're still not quite getting to the anxieties, however, which are and thank you for explaining strategic questions. But there is a definite anxiety in Europe about grey zone warfare and digital threat. Not helped by the activities of the new polar bear, for example, cable cutting in the Baltic, accompanied by a Russian ship. Now, those may be sailing in parallel, but they're sailing in the same direction. And so these questions for Europe are, I think they probably need a more robust discussion about what the limits would be. I mean, clearly China doesn't want to see a nuclear war in Europe. Well, that's a good thing. On the other hand, what are the limits in grey zone? An activity that China is very adept at, as we see, around Taiwan. An activity that Russia is also very adept at. And that's a concern.
Well, you brought up a question which is not verified, but that would be very serious if indeed China was found, cutting the undersea cable.
It was a Chinese ship.
Yeah, it is a Chinese ship, but from my gut feeling as a Chinese, I don't believe that there is any reason for China to do that, and I would welcome a serious investigation, because that kind of acquisition will be very serious. And why would China all of a sudden decide to cut the sea cable in Europe? For what? China is not involved in the war in Ukraine, and China definitely wants to keep its name clean. And why would China all of a sudden decide to cut the cable around the seabed? Yeah, there was some talk about that, but I would really welcome serious investigation. But I believe the investigation so far did not prove that China was doing.
Not least because China did not cooperate in the investigation.
Well, it depends on how you define it. I don't know the details, but I believe probably if China did not cooperate, I assume maybe the Chinese government would be feeling like me. This is totally incomprehensible. It's so absurd. Yeah, for China to say, okay, we fully cooperate with you on this matter, which is totally impossible. I think I just guessed, but I would welcome serious investigation into this, because this is very much like India's belief that China wants to encircle India, right? I think this is a kind of self-praise in another way. Why? Because some Indian strategists believe India is so important. Yeah, so therefore China wants to encircle India. But China's economy is 5 times bigger than India's. And China certainly is under competition with the United States. And China worries about any moves in Taiwan. Why would China suddenly decide to encircle India? So this kind of a logic doesn't make sense. In the same way, what you are talking about, for me, it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Maybe can I first say that I am very, very happy that we can have this conversation, because actually that has become a very rare opportunity to to have these kinds of pretty robust exchanges as well. And I think that's where the level where we need to get back to in the Europe-China conversation, that we can have actual conversations about the actual things and not just pleasantries that are being exchanged. So first of all, I want to thank both of you for engaging in a pretty robust conversation, if that's okay. And then also to say, I fully understand China's strategic objectives with regard to Russia. They make total sense. They make sense from a strategic perspective. They make sense from overarching strategic goals. You're worried about a potential military escalation with the United States, not even of your choosing, but it could happen. Then having access to land and food, to energy and food resources coming through the landway, having a border that you don't need to worry about, having a strategic stability where that's needed, having collaboration on military industrial goods with a large neighbor, all of that makes total sense. It just doesn't mean that Europe must like it. And I think that's sort of that's it, as it is with the structural economic relationship. There are some structural factors in our relationship that are currently mutually incompatible, where we acknowledge that, where it's better to acknowledge it than to say that it's not there. Because I think that's where the Europeans at the moment feel a bit like, you can't tell us you're not a challenge to us when you are sort of strategically enabling the Russian economy to be able to fight a war that is against our interests. So I think that's something where we just have to acknowledge that there are differences in the view that we can see if we can navigate them and see where they are particularly problematic and how we can mitigate them. But I don't think they'll go away by ignoring them. And if I'm allowed to, one more thing on the sort of trust question and the trade-offs question. I think this is, again, just reinserting a little bit of nuance here, but we're playing a very, very complicated kind of multidimensional chess game here. When we look at, as a democratic government in Europe, you want to provide economic prosperity, you want to provide security, and you know you have to do something about climate change because we believe in science and we believe that this is going to be a problem. So squaring all those three at the moment is not going to work. So in every sector, you will have to take decisions of what is the level of risk we're willing to take on security terms to mitigate the carbon footprint. What is the willingness that we take? Where is the economic hit possible to do that? Where is it not possible? Because if we create an economy that is solely focused on one of these goals, then we will not have popular buy-in in a democratic society. That's just as simple as it is. We can't build we will have a kind of a green dictatorship in Europe. That's not going to work. Similarly, all the arguments that are saying everything has to be subsumed under security. Trust me, I'm living in Berlin right now. That's not the conversation we're having. I mean, you can't have everything else being cut, all spending being cut just for security spending right now. So I think this is where, for European governments, it is so tricky to find these balances. And we have published a report to try to go through this in like 3 green tech areas, just to provide a sort of a roadmap for this, to say what are potential factors that could be seen as problematic. And connectedness, for example, was one of them. So whereas we would say like there's zero problem in importing a vast degree of Chinese solar panels, still argue 100% dependence is never good, and China wouldn't go into that direction. It's not clever. But a 50% dependence is totally fine for a good that is stockpilable, that is not connected, where we are just benefiting from sort of the economies of scale that are presented. And that looks very different from critical infrastructure that is heavily connected like a wind turbine. Because if it can be accessed externally, it can create damage. So I think it is about all of these areas in which we have to start, unfortunately, introducing a level of complexity that politicians have to juggle in their head, and that they have to also be able to communicate to the population. And that's their problem. I think that's sort of, we can only, as academics, we can only kind of provide the sort of the roadmap for that. But it is a real challenge. And I don't think that by ignoring it and saying there are easy solutions to any of this, there aren't right now. And I think it's really important to stress again, no one's saying in Europe that we want to cut all relations with China, that we want to decouple fully our economies. That's not the point. There's a question of a rebalancing that is fundamentally necessary from the perspective of security and prosperity here. And I think the connected vehicles debate plays into exactly that factor. There is a limit of trust that is currently available, and that is due to also Chinese activities and actions in Europe. So,
ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to hear from you. I can see the hands going up. It would be very helpful if you could tell us who you are, and if you're directing your question to a particular panel, indicate that too. Otherwise, I would like to step in.
Imitative Director Ludarendorf program here at this fine center. Thank you very much to all the participants in the channel, at least for reaching and let's say robust. Janka preempted my first question about green tech, but there are other sectors that might be of interest, and Zhou bringing in artificial intelligence, deep sea now it's a hot topic. It's an open source linguistic model, so it can be done independently in Europe. So I'll be curious to get your thinking about this domain. Second question, Europe and China have been competitors also in third countries. Development assistance, but also trade is an issue. You have the global gateway, you have the Mercosur trade agreement. Now, if you're Brazil, of course, you might want to diversify with China and European markets there. So from Europe's perspective, and that's probably to Janka, but also to the others, is it a game that Europe has lost, especially in the global south? China has so much more to offer, or is it just another area of competition that Europe has some cards to play to quote a certain US president?
So who would like to respond on DeepSeek and large language models?
I'm not an expert on this, very young.
Okay.
So what I find interesting about DeepSeek is it's more theoretical. As I'm not a technology, like I'm not studying it, not yet. Maybe I have to do that in this fun later on. But I think what I found interesting about it is that the development came at a very opportune time, and I would say in this case it's just luck. That it came at a moment before the trade war that actually instilled confidence in the Chinese business community to a level that would otherwise not have been there right now. It instilled possibilities in the Chinese market also for European companies. If you think about automated driving, integration of these speech models into the cars, then without the Chinese model under trade war conditions, this would look very different. And I think this sort of DeepSeek factor coming back from conversations in Delhi, it's sort of proof of concept that certain things are possible, and that has unleashed something in the rest of the world that you don't need to be the US and have the kind of billions available that OpenAI has to actually build a model that could work. And so I think that's something that I think we need to be very, very clear about, that the possibilities that this provides now actually provide the Chinese leadership a slightly better hand in the current conflict that they're facing, and therefore are super important and are part of a really good story. The story is this is homegrown. This is done with engineers that are all Chinese trained. This is sort of the Zhang kind of party. Those are the ones that are showing that they can actually do this. This is a new powerhouse that's being created. That's important. And I think at a time of a trade war where Donald Trump has prepared his population only for winning, Chinese leadership has prepared their people for struggle. Any psychological advantage is a very important one. And whether Europe has lost in the global south, I don't think so. Also, just coming back from Delhi, the interest in a free trade agreement with Europe couldn't be higher. It wasn't as high in the last 30 years. So I think there is a real question of whether Europe can get its act together and become an attractive partner. Players that are not willing to play the game that everything is just to be about the US and China. There is a lot of potential, but it will require Europe to be at its best and not at a kind of shady version of itself.
So France should ratify.
I don't normally think of students as shy, but yes, please, we'll take a few. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the very insightful kind of discussion. My name is Xiang. I'm a doctoral student here in economic geography at Oxford. I guess I have two questions. One is slightly offensive, and the other one is equally or more offensive. Anyway.
Thanks for the preparation.
So my first question goes to Oertel. So you basically cited the Hudson News to show the willing and the determination of Chinese government to intervene in the entrepreneurial activities. And And I guess this is the beauty of the journalism. They kind of never lie, but they only offer you part of the truth. So it can like largely affect your perception. And I want to add some context and details because basically there are Chinese companies who bid it again and again and again and at far higher prices for the ports. And the Hutchison Group, they were reluctant to sell the ports to the Chinese company, not because it's not a lucrative act. As a matter of fact, it's the other way around. But there were inside sources saying that there have been menaces from the U.S. government, and basically the Hutchison Group, they fear that if they sold such critical ports to the Chinese enterprises, they might get a sanction from the U.S. side. And I also want to refer to a recent report. I think it just happened last week or a month before. So basically, Fairly company in Italy is a tire company, a manufacturing company. And so basically, this Chinese company, Petrochem, is the single largest stakeholder behind Fairly. It has, I don't know, maybe like 37% of the old stakeholders stakes of that company. But basically last week or last month, it was kicked out of the voting board.
I'm hoping your question contains a question at some point.
Yeah. I'm going to ask this question.
Thank you.
And basically, they're the single largest stakeholder, but they don't have any voting rights. And so here's my question. Sorry. Basically, when you take into account the actions of the Italian government, of the U.S. government, how do you think the actions are so different from the actions of Chinese government? And do you think, and will you think, they're also showing the determinants or the willing of the U.S. government and the Italian government to intervene any entrepreneurial activities?
Thank you.
And my second question goes to Professor Yao. Sorry. Because you just mentioned that the Chinese are saving so much, largely and primarily because of the culture to save more. And I have to say, I observe a little bit different things as a Chinese in Chinese society. Basically, there are large numbers of farmers and peasants in China, and there are huge rural and urban divides in Chinese society in terms of welfare, pensions, and you name it. And for example, my grandparents, they literally spare any penny in case that they may fall ill. And what's more, I worked in Shanghai for 2 years, and I observed the youngsters in Shanghai, so urban residents, they have all the willing to spend more, to consume more. But for one thing, most of them, I have to say, they have to work over 10 or at least 9 hours, 10 hours a day. What could they do after work? Basically not to consume.
So they don't have time to spend.
Yeah. And another thing
what's your question?
Yeah, sorry. And another thing is that there are the heavy pressure of education and housing prices. So my question is, given those reasons, what do you think? How much the culture of saving more contributes to the fact that this Chinese society is saving so much? Yeah.
So there are other factors, I think.
Yeah, basically, okay. I think so.
Could I take a few more while we're at it? Yes, you two gentlemen there, and then you.
Yeah, I have a quick and straightforward question, and not aggressive at all. Basically, I'm just being curious that from the European perspective, what sector will you think is safe and good for China to invest in? Because I think like the sovereign wealth fund in Middle East do invest a lot in UK and Europe. So I'm just curious about, like, from a European perspective, what sectors really welcome the foreign investment.
Do you want to just identify yourself?
Oh yeah, my name is Hao Lei, and I'm a second-year DPhil student from University of Sociology Department.
Great. And the gentleman next to you.
Yes, I'm Fan Qi. I'm a postdoc fellow in the Sociology Department here, and also I'm an associate from China Center. So my question is very short. What do you think of the current and the future UK and China relationship?
Okay. And one more there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm David Artendia, a PhD candidate in law and working on EU-China relations, actually. I just submitted my thesis, so I'm not sure what my status is. But anyway. So a very brief question for the overall panel. So what's the role of political conditionality in negotiating trade agreements? Because linking this question to your comment before, it seems that China has a strategic or a structural advantage vis-a-vis Europe when negotiating trade agreements with other countries in Latin America, in Africa, etc. Because China usually don't demand political reforms in those countries. It doesn't care much about human rights, rule of law, democracy, and so on. Whereas in Europe, it seems that we care, or at least we claim to care about this, right? So it seems that there is like an advantage that we cannot compete with against China in this area. Thank you.
That's the often quoted remark that Europe comes and gives a lecture, China comes and you get an airport. Right. Who'd like to take that one? Do you want to start? Yeah. You don't want to start? You want to?
Okay. The culture thing, saving culture thing. Yeah, I don't deny there are many factors over there, but you have to look at the data, right? The thing that over the last 20 years, China's social security has been strengthened greatly, including the countryside, right? The countryside used not to have any medical care. Okay, over the last 2 decades, China has built a robust, full coverage healthcare system in the countryside. But people still say, right? But I really don't think this kind of uncertain about the future lack of social security, the big reason for China's high saving rate. You can also raise other factors, but those are small, right? Doing international comparison, you're going to see China saves too much. Another society that's also mostly Chinese society that saves a lot. That's Singapore. Okay, that's the same. Okay. Conditions on other countries, yeah, China does not require so-called conditionality when China provides official assistance to other countries. But Europe and other countries do want other countries to do something, right? Personally, I don't think Europe and the United States have the right approach, right? There's no way for outsiders to force other countries to. That's going to just do the opposite. Okay, each country, every country has a national pride. And the key of national pride is I have to decide by my own. Okay, even if you give me money, you are not in no position to tell me how to conduct my domestic politics or economic business. Okay, so look at the track record. Look at the conditionality, right, imposed by the West and other international organizations. They all fail. Okay, that sounds like emotional, but I'm an economist. I studied political economy in those countries. Change of institution is so slow. It takes not just a decade, but centuries, right? I think Europeans have all forgot how you got today. It took the centuries of fights. Okay, now you ask those developing countries, hey, you have to change this overnight. Is that possible? That's impossible, right? You have to give the people in developing countries to decide on their own role. Okay, that takes time, but be patient. I mean, I can say the same toward China. Your attitude toward China, you say, oh, China has human rights issue, China has this problem. Yes, that's right. Yeah. But we are on the road to change, right? You think about it, when China was forced to open its door to the West, that was only 160 years ago. That's a short for a country like China, so big. And it has a huge bag of history on its back. never stop for 3,000 years, with records. And they always say 5,000 years, right? You expected China to change over like 5 years? That's impossible. Okay, that's just impossible. I mean, I was educated in the United States. I feel more urgency for China's change. I have to be patient. Okay, I have to stay in the country. Okay, right? So I can make a change, make a difference in China. That takes a long time. Okay, so on that time, I think that China's approach is much better. Leave it alone to other countries for them to decide.
Mr. Zhou, would you like to comment on the state of UK-China relations?
Okay. Since Yaya mentioned that he was educated in the United States, and I'm a postgraduate from Cambridge, I think I'm in a better position than he is.
You're not meant to admit that in Oxford.
China-UK relationship, yeah. I think, well, when we think about our relationship, for example, with the UK or with Germany, apparently it's different because Germany and France certainly have more industrial trading, yeah, so on so forth, with China, and it's not the case with UK. But I think the UK's strongest advantages are found in some areas such as education, yeah, with this kind of looming danger of Chinese students being rejected by the United States. Actually, you could benefit from this. If having more Chinese students to come, and then I think we could also learn a lot from your media, for example. Yeah, that's a big question for us. Yeah, so how can Chinese media be trusted? Yeah, and Chinese people know that. Yeah, so that is why our president said, well, to tell a good Chinese story, but it seems that. For decades, we don't have many Chinese people who can tell a Chinese story. Once the chief editor of South China Morning Post told me, okay, for decades I've been watching. Are there more than 5 people who can actually articulate China's point of view? And I asked him, could both of us be 2 of these 5 people? Yeah, yeah. So, for example, BBC. Yeah, if you ask people who are somewhat educated in China, whether they know BBC, they will say yes. If you ask them about the ABC, NBC, the CBC, no, they don't know it. Yeah, so I think you really have some strong advantages. And but one of the concerns for China in this relationship, I believe, is how your relationship with the United States might become a concern for China. Yeah, that is certainly the case because of your special relationship. So, but with Donald Trump, with what we have seen, yeah, the continued but the steady decline of Western democracy, so would you still attach such great importance to this special relationship? So this is a question for you to think about.
Then take the first person first. I would say we precisely agree with each other. That is precisely the problem. I don't disagree that the BlackRock version of this was equally very, very weird at this point in time, that this investment came at a very, very strange moment. The problem that I see is not the question of will there be intervention. There will always be intervention for political reasons. It's just, could our interests diverge? And could that be potentially problematic? And I think this is the question that we have to ask ourselves as well. We have seized Russian assets in Europe as well, because our interests diverge and we have seized those assets. So I think this is something where, from a European perspective, we have to see, is a Chinese investment in a way problematic? So that if our interests diverge, it creates a problem for us. If all of the investment is withdrawn, if the factory is closed down, as you saw here with British Steel just recently, is that a problem then or not? And so I think this is where we precisely, it's just that if the Chinese government continues to say, we will never do that, and then they do precisely that, it's not helping the narrative. It's not a very good moment to put your cards on the table like this And I think that's something that the Europeans have just taken note of, and certainly taken note of the US position as well. In Germany, I can tell you the level of sort of anti-Americanism and how it has kind of flipped at the moment is quite stark and striking. So that I'm sometimes worried that we're forgetting about the challenges that China poses just in the wake of all of the worry about the Trump administration. The second, the question was very precise, what sectors are safe and good for China to invest. If only it were that easy, we would provide the little green list to the EU Commission and we could kind of go down the checklist. Actually, we did an exercise like that with Bertelsmann Foundation a while ago. There was a question of the green listing, whether that could be done or whether that could at least be done some red listing. I think this is more the sector, the sectoral analysis where we're now at. Sort of, there can be sectors that are sort of off limits and all other sectors are case by case decisions, depending on the overall balance of the relationship. I know that Dan Rosen from Rhodium Group always joked and said underwear and socks will be okay, but then we had the Xinjiang cotton question, and it was not so okay anymore. So it was sort of, I think there's no sector itself that is highly problematic. Where it would be attractive for Europeans to find a good agreement that is sort of in balance, I would say solar panel production to reshore some of that, not necessarily to Europe, but elsewhere in the world as well, and battery production. Those are the two key ones where finding an agreement that could work for the Europeans, and that's not saying those sectors are completely unproblematic, but would be very much in the interest for the European economy. Yeah, and I like your argument on UK and China. It's like, if you have no industry to lose, you have much less of a problem. It's the cynical German comment at the end. I was just a bit mean. No, but it does.
We found common ground.
No, but I think what's important about that is also to underscore there are differences in the perspectives, and we can't say it's exactly the same between all the European member states. There is going to be a very different perspective if you have no car industry. Same conversation in Australia right now. It's going to be a very different conversation that you have if you have one. And I think also acknowledging that is totally fair enough. But that doesn't mean that there can't be some overarching shared assessments about the situation. But the approach that the UK will take towards China will likely differ from the one that Germany will take in the nuances of the relationship. And I think that's fair enough. That's why we also have bilateral relationship. And then on the question of the conditionality, so I could very meanly say that the Chinese leadership always kind of brushes under the rug that they have one very important political conditionality every agreement that they sign, and that is the question of Taiwan. So that be clear, there's no conditionality here as well. That's always an important and very political point. But I think more so it is the Europeans have, cynically speaking, been extremely flexible in this regard. The trade with China has not been a problem because of human rights. It's now becoming a problem because of our economic competition. So I think if we're looking at also the way that the Europeans are negotiating trade agreements right now, there's a level of flexibility that is being presented that is very much adjusted and attuned to the realities that are found on the ground. And I think we also have to maybe stop putting that hat on all the time that we're the moral preachers. We're actually not. We're the cynical traders. That's not a great label to have either, but it's sort of, I think we have been hiding behind that for a really long time. And I found that dissonance often more troubling, that we're not actually straightforward in our interests, that we're not actually straightforward in also what the economic gains for Europe could be.
Thank you very much. Next round. Have you exhausted the audience? It's quite warm in here. Okay, now I'm going to start at the back again, please. So I can see two hands. Yes, you and that gentleman, and yes. Yes, please. Just tell us who you are.
Yeah, I am Chong Kun. I'm a master's student in the China Studies program. I've got two questions for Senior Colonel Zhou. I think we've heard the European concerns of the matter. I wonder if you could share more about how you view China's non-condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And secondly, you mentioned China's role in the conflict in a longer term, where we have a peace deal or where there's a condition for armistice. I wonder if you think that China is willing, or whether is it able to do anything for relevant parties to get there in the short term. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so there was another gentleman behind. Yes.
My name is Brian. I'm a MPhil student in international relations here, and my question is directed at Dr. Oertel. What's the scope of cooperation between Europe and the United States in the Trumpian world? you mentioned that the EU is pursuing a dual de-risking strategy from the US as well as China, but within the US, there are some policy discussions about the need to have an allied scale strategy, pooling resources among allies. Are there any real appetite from the European side, or is it wishful thinking?
Thank you. And yes.
John Arnold, former EU official, former visiting fellow here as panelist. Just like to ask our Chinese presenters whether part of their thinking about dealing with the post-Trumpian world is looking at something that Trump rejects, which is a role for international organizations, which apply a set of rules about how we trade, maybe in the future how we invest. Hear anything about that? I think one of the things that concerns me is having observed some discussions going on between the EU and China about what can we do with WTO, especially WTO, where the Americans are already thinking they might leave. And I detect from some of the things that were said, Chinese friends, is that the underlying message is let's just deal with each other on our own terms, and there's not much room for international making. It's a very minor one. And I can't see how in a world where investment has indeed become much more important for the development of economies and for world growth than trade, how we can go on with very important trading partners, not talking about the leaves of the game, which does include subsidization. Got to have some sort of discipline about how fast you channel money by state power to growing industries, infant industries, to make them world leaders within 10 years, which is what China has done in a number of sectors. So I think this is what I would call the missing link. A sense of, are we still going to be in a world, in your view, that has no real rules about the way we conduct investment as well as trade. It's the strongest, or the most gifted, or those with the biggest pockets who actually are the corner of the market.
Thank you. That's it. You want to explain who you're going to benefit those who don't?
Sure. So currently, the budget commission will get Minister of Finance. Okay. My question is both Europe and China. We've seen two incidents with the infrastructure that Europe currently uses to a large extent to communicate with its population. One is Musk just killed access to the opposition in Turkey through Twitter.
Okay.
The other one is we've seen TikTok being brutally used in the Romanian elections to essentially by Russian actors to essentially influence the elections. So the question for Europe is to what extent is Europe concerned about that and ready to do something about it? And the question for China is to what extent is China willing or able to use its influence on TikTok to stop all such political activity by nefarious actors?
Worth remembering that TikTok's banned in India and has been for many years.
Not in Europe.
No, not in Europe. No. But it's not just a European concern. So who wants to start there?
Let me say
Yes.
first, because my answer to the two questions are very simple. Yeah, so all others are complicated. I really enjoy to be a simple-minded soldier, right? Yeah. So first of all, China's attitude toward Russia. Well, I think Chinese government had actually criticized Russia in the beginning, but in a way that seems to be too subtle. That is the problem, if it is a problem, because China is just a code for respect for sovereignty. Saying something like that, it actually suggests that Russia, you are not respecting sovereignty of another country. But this is Chinese way of criticizing Russia, which seems to be acceptable to Russia, yeah, given this important relationship. And then at the UN Security Council, China has also been doing its best. Yeah, sometimes it even condemned this aggression, but most time kind of would prefer not to to yes or no, but such as abstain from all these kind of things. And then could China help Europe to reach either ceasefire or armistice? I don't think so. I think the China wants to help. That certainly is true, as I said, because China has tabled a number of proposals, which, however, did not work. And President Zelensky even described China's and Brazil's proposal as destructive. Yeah. So I think that China's possible role would only come after a ceasefire, which basically can only be negotiated by Washington and Moscow without Kiev. So after that, what I have suggested that China could become maybe, yeah, a major power to guarantee this kind of ceasefire or armistice. Or if peacekeeping is needed, yeah, then China could probably take the lead. But it is a big if, because first of all, for peacekeeping to happen, it first needs the consent of the warring parties. I myself have been in charge of peacekeeping, so I know the procedure. The procedure is if these two warring parties, either two parties within the country or two warring states, they have to just ask your Security Council for help, and normally United States, France, and Britain will come to have a kind of agreement, and then some of them will come to China, and China then would talk to Russia. So if all these P5 agree, then a mandate would be issued, and a mission would be established. But in this case, of course, it's somewhat special in that Russia itself it is one of the warring parties. But I believe if Russia still wants it, so that still could be achievable. Otherwise, because these four regions, yeah, I believe one day Russia would be able to have full control of the four regions. Even if Europe is still supporting Ukraine, but without a kind of a formal agreement, these four regions would be Russia's Achilles heel. It's just as simple as that, because Ukrainians could just fight like guerrillas, mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet invaders.
Thank you. Which country in the world on rules on investment and trade? China's view of the international institutions.
Okay, I can pick up this question. At the one level, I don't think the Trump tariff war has totally changed the world trading system or investment regime, right? At least we don't see that EU and China are engaging kind of tariff war, right? So China and the EU have negotiated EU tariffs on Chinese EVs, and I think it's getting a solution very soon. Okay, and between China and other countries, I don't think much has been changed. Okay, so in a sense, what I want to say, probably we shouldn't exaggerate the Trump shock. Okay, probably it only affects the United States and other countries. And that has been said, I can also sense out that more countries are now emphasizing security, subsidies, dependence, those kind of concerns. Okay. So in that sense, probably we are in a post-globalization period. Okay, so it's no longer the WTO world. Okay, and we're not going to see so-called behind-border harmonization of rules and the regulations. So we're in a new world. This means to remember in 2016, me, myself, and Danny Roderick from Harvard and Jeff Lehman from NYU Shanghai, we elected a discussion group with economists, legal scholars, including some Nobel Prize winners. So we had the workshop discussions. In the end, we issued a statement trying to respond to the first Trump administration's trade war with China. Okay, but of course, not all the people at that time agreed with us. Okay, but it seems that we were correct, predicting that the world is entering the post-globalization era. So we have to think about the new rules, some kind of probably going back to gap period. No, right? But we have to kind of engineer a new world trading and investment regime that allows different countries to exercise some protective powers. Yeah. Those are preliminary thoughts.
Do new rules mean new institutions also, or would you think that's doable within the existing institutions?
New, I don't know. I don't know. WTO doesn't work today, right? So
No, but there is perhaps it could be revived. Would you support an effort to revive it or not?
You have to persuade the United States on board. If the US rejects, how can you revive WTO, right? I don't know. I'm not an expert on this.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll take then the scope of cooperation between the US, Europe, and China, and the Musk and Romania and Twitter and TikTok conundrum. So on the scope of cooperation between the US and Europe and China, at the beginning of the Trump administration, that was part of the offer of the European side. We thought we could kind of fend all of this off by saying energy purchases, military equipment purchases, collaboration on China, you stay in Ukraine, we're all game. That did not fly much. No one liked our offer so much. I think since then, the cards have been reshuffled multiple times. No one really knows what the US wants from Europe as well. Unclear. When the trade delegations come back, they come back and say, we're really not clearer about what the US wants from us. So far, there has been no ask on China. There has been no kind of demand to collaborate on anything China related. I think there's an openness in a nuanced way, again, on the European side to say where our interests intersect. When it comes to high-tech exports or when it comes to overcapacities, there is a willingness to see where collaboration with the United States is possible. But the level of soberness with which the US is being approached ever since the security guarantees rug has been sort of pulled out underneath the feet, I would say is pretty significant. So even, we always have to remind ourselves that it's only been 100 days. It feels a lot longer. But if in 6 months' time, changes are afoot and things are kind of going into a different direction, there may be a conversation about the collective challenges that China poses. I would not put money on it at the moment, probably, that the economic security gang that is actually quite interested in this, people in the USTR, people that are sort of more on the economic security side of things are actually interested in collaborating with allies on these issues, that they will prevail. I think the decisions today to fire the National Security Advisor Co. point in a different direction, let's put it like that. The Musk, Twitter, Romania, TikTok question is super interesting because it provides another avenue of possibility for the Europeans. It was super hard to do something on TikTok for any single European politician. What are you going to do? You're going to go out and say, I'm going to ban TikTok. I'm going to draw the kind of anger of, maybe the support of all parent of a teenager, but the anger of a population. It wasn't a winning proposition. Actually, Musk and the interventions in European politics, I can just say from a German perspective, during the election campaign, to have a rally together with the leader of the far right was not really helping Twitter's popularity in Germany. So, so right now, kind of, it is politically more palpable and kind of more doable to just act on both. It feels kind of weirdly fairer almost. So I think there are some measures where one has to look out for how China measures might be packaged as US measures, because that's actually more sellable in Europe at the moment than a China measure. And where these could become sort of, interesting forms of new package deals that I see Timothy shaking his head, that we would never have thought would be possible. But I do think that right now, that's sort of the sentiment that is there in Europe. And again, that brings me to the point that I don't quite understand why the Chinese leadership seems very unwilling to take European concerns seriously at the moment and actually come to the negotiating table at eye level, because there would be opportunities for some pragmatic collaboration at the moment that I don't see happening under the current circumstances. I'll leave it at that because I think my brain is a bit fried by the temperature. It's sort of the resilience test. Could I just actually come back to you on TikTok? Could you imagine the Chinese government responding to European concerns about TikTok in any way? And if so, what would that look like?
What's the European concern?
That there is a potential for TikTok to be used, for example, in the case of Romania and the elections, it was used by the Russians to spread misinformation and disinformation on a truly epic scale.
I really don't think that the Chinese government will use TikTok to influence.
No, that wasn't the question. Would the Chinese government make a gesture towards those concerns to offer some guarantee that TikTok would not be used in such a way?
How can the Chinese government guarantee it? I mean, it's not going to do anything using TikTok.
But it's not going to intervene with TikTok for the sake of international relations.
TikTok doesn't belong to
but I think
Chinese.
we also there's influence.
Right, the owner now is Singapore.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a no.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm afraid we're getting very close to the end. I'm just going to ask my panelists, just as a closing round. Clearly, there are difficulties in the EU-China relationship, but there's also a huge amount of potential. If you had to make two proposals to move this relationship forward, to solve a problem, to increase the cooperation landscape, to diminish the problems of trust, what would they be? Who's going to? How about the simple soldier beginning? Simple question.
Well, I think my proposal is to let the United States and Russia to come quickly to a solution of the war in Ukraine. Whatever it might look like, it will just solve this, it will just in a big way resolve this kind of solid relationship between China and the Europe. That is my suggestion.
And your second suggestion?
I don't believe. My second suggestion is let's try very hard and not to let a war erupt in Taiwan Strait, because I believe so long as there is no war in Taiwan Strait, China-European relationship by and large is still manageable.
It's very interesting. I was just thinking we've gone nearly 2 hours without Taiwan becoming a kind of focus, which is very unusual in a China discussion. Suggestions?
Well, I think both sides can do something. For the China side, probably should take Europe more seriously, particularly European concerns. Probably now it's too late, but China probably should have showed more love for the Ukrainians. Right? I think more balanced. Although China didn't support Russia, but China can take a more balanced approach to the two countries. But on the other hand, the Europeans should understand probably China's position more. For example, the question just asked, China to provide kind of a guarantee that China is not going to use TikTok to mess up with European politics. I mean, for China, that's out of the question, right? So it's I think Europeans have to understand China more, particularly China's approach to international relations. You have to take it seriously that China insists on this no interference policy. That's serious, and China has kept its words.
You gave me enough time to think about it. Thank you very much. So I would say the Europeans have to urgently give up all remaining illusions about the possibilities of the Chinese market, because this is driving a very weird version of a European discourse that is very divisive among them, and therefore not creating a good basis for a conversation between China and Europe. If we believe that, like the Volkswagen CEO says, that 15% market share are possible, then sorry, that's not going to be the sober basis that we need for the kind of negotiation that is ahead of us. On the other side, I would say, from a Chinese government perspective, there has to be a start of a real negotiation. At the moment, we're seeing a play for time because the Chinese leadership believes that time's on their side. And I think what the Europeans are demonstrating is that they can flip that balance and make the time play on their side. And so once we start, all drop the nonsense and have an actual conversation about the real things, then I think we can move some of these areas forward. And we have to have areas in which we accept that there will be no progress. And the relationship should reach a level after 50 years of diplomatic relations of robustness to withstand that as well.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, I think the three of you have given us a fine example of dropping the nonsense and having a robust conversation. And I'm extremely grateful to you. So Yang Zhou and Janka, thank you very much. Please join me.